Recently I've been reading and enjoying Spontaneous Healing by Andrew Weil, and I'm going to do like sort of a little audiobook here for you all. I thought it might be interesting to share some of the things that he has in here with the community, specifically regarding his encounter with Dr. Fulford, and a little bit of information there about Fulford's practice, and just a first-person encounter with such an iconic osteopathic physician. That I thought everyone might find interesting as well. So this book was published in 1995, and if you're waiting for anything more interesting than the next load of oak to burn through the wood stove here, you're going to be waiting a while. So this is maybe best listened to while you wash the dishes or something like that, like an audiobook. So let's get into it. I'm going to read you the introduction, the prologue, and then the first chapter dealing with Weil's encounter with Fulford. I'm probably going to mispronounce some of the names of the Greek gods and stuff like that, forgive me. But yeah, here we go. Introduction. A man whose lungs are filled with cancer is sent home to die, having been told that medicine can do nothing for him. 6 months later, he reappears in his doctor's office, tumor-free. A young woman, diabetic, a heavy smoker, lies unconscious in a coronary care unit following a bad heart attack. Her doctor anguishes over the fact that her cardiac function is rapidly declining and he is powerless to save her. But the next morning she is awake and talking, clearly on the way to recovery. A neurosurgeon tells grieving parents that their son, who is in a coma following a motorcycle accident and severe head injury, will never regain consciousness. The son is now fine. Most doctors I know have one or two stories of this sort, stories of spontaneous healing. You will uncover many more of them if you seek them out, yet few medical researchers do. To most doctors, the stories are just stories, not taken seriously, not studied, not looked at as sources of information about the body's potential to repair itself. Meanwhile, modern medicine has become so expensive that Modern medicine has become so expensive that it is straining the economies of many developed nations and putting itself beyond the reach of much of the world's population. In many countries, politicians argue about how to pay for health care, unaware that a philosophical debate about the very nature of health care has been ongoing throughout history. Doctors believe that health requires outside intervention of one sort or another, while proponents of natural hygiene maintain that health results from living in harmony with natural law. Sound familiar? In ancient Greece, doctors worked under the patronage of Asclepius, the god of medicine, but healers served Asclepios' daughter, the radiant Hygeia, goddess of health. Medical writer and philosopher René Dubois has written, "For the worshippers of Hygeia, health is the natural order of things, a positive attribute to which men are entitled if they govern their lives wisely. According to them, the most important function of medicine is to discover and teach the natural laws which will ensure a man a healthy mind in a healthy body. More skeptical or wiser in the ways of the world, the followers of Asclepius believe that the chief role of the physician is to treat disease, to restore health by correcting any imperfections caused by accidents of birth or life. Political debates about how to cover the costs of medical care mostly take place among followers of Asclepius. There has been no argument about the nature of medicine or people's expectations of it, only about who is going to pay for its services, which have become inordinately expensive because of doctors' reliance on technology. I am a dedicated follower of Hygeia, and I want to interject that viewpoint into any discussions of the future of medicine. Let me give an example of how these different philosophies lead to very different courses of action. In the West, a major focus of scientific medicine has been the identification of external agents of disease and the development of weapons against them. An outstanding success in the middle of this century was the discovery of antibiotics, and with that, great victories against infectious diseases caused by bacteria. This success was a major factor in winning hearts and minds over to the Asclepian side, convincing most people that medical intervention with the products of technology was worth it, no matter the cost. In the East, especially in China, medicine has had quite a different focus. It has explored ways of increasing internal resistance to disease, so that no matter what harmful influences you are exposed to, you can remain healthy. a Hygieian strategy. In their explorations, Chinese doctors have discovered many natural substances that have such tonic effects on the body. Although the Western approach has served us well for a number of years, its long-term usefulness may not be nearly so great as the Eastern one. Weapons are dangerous. They may backfire, causing injury to the user, and they may also stimulate greater aggression on the part of the enemy. In fact, infectious disease specialists throughout the world are now wringing their hands over the possibility of untreatable plagues of resistant organisms. Just today I received a copy of Clinical Research News for Arizona Physicians, a publication of the University Medical Center where I teach, that featured an article on resistance to antimicrobial agents, a new plague. It reads in part, while antimicrobial agents have been considered the wonder drugs of the 20th century, clinicians and researchers are now acutely aware that microbial resistance to drugs has become a major clinical problem. A variety of solutions have been proposed. The pharmaceutical industry is attempting to develop new agents that are less susceptible to current resistance mechanisms. Unfortunately, the organisms appear to rapidly develop new resistance mechanisms. In the inpatient setting, strict adherence to infection control procedures is essential. Healthcare workers need to understand that antimicrobial resistance is an accelerating problem in all practice settings that can directly compromise patient outcomes. The phrase, "can directly compromise patient outcomes," is euphemistic. It means patients will die of infections that doctors formerly could treat with antibiotics. In fact, antibiotics are rapidly losing their power, and some infectious disease specialists are beginning to think about what we will do when we can no longer rely on them. We might have to revert to methods used in hospitals in the 1920s and the 1930s before there were antibiotics. Strict quarantine and disinfection, surgical drainage, and so forth. What a reversal that will be for technological medicine. Meanwhile, resistance does not develop to the tonics of Chinese medicine because they are not acting against germs and do not therefore influence their evolution, but rather are acting with the body's defenses. They increase activity and efficiency of cells and the immune system, helping patients resist all kinds of infections, not just those caused by bacteria. Antibiotics are only effective against bacteria. They are of no use in diseases caused by viruses. Western medicine's powerlessness against viral infections is clearly visible in its ineffectiveness against AIDS. Chinese herbal therapy for people infected with HIV looks much more promising. It is non-toxic, in great contrast to the Western antiviral drugs in current use, and may enable many of those with HIV infection to have relatively long, symptom-free lives, even though the virus remains in their bodies. The Eastern concept of strengthening internal defenses is Hygieian, because it assumes that the body has a natural ability to resist and deal with agents of disease. If that assumption were more prominent in Western medicine, we would not now have an economic crisis in healthcare, because methods that take advantage of the body's natural healing abilities are far cheaper than the intensive interventions of technological medicine, as well as safer and more effective over time. Asclepians are most interested in treatment, while Hygieians are interested in healing. Treatment originates outside. Healing comes from within. The word healing means making whole, that is, restoring integrity and balance. I have long been interested in stories about healing, and I assume you are too. Perhaps you know someone who experienced a spontaneous remission of cancer, in which widespread malignant disease disappeared to the amazement of doctors in charge of the case. Maybe the disappearance was temporary, or maybe it was permanent. What happened? Or perhaps you know someone who was healed by prayer or by religious fervor. I have titled this book Spontaneous Healing because I want to call attention to the innate, intrinsic nature of the healing process. This is now in italics. Even when treatments are applied with successful outcomes, those outcomes represent activation of intrinsic healing mechanisms, which, under other circumstances, might operate without any outside stimulus. The main theme of this book is very simple. The body can heal itself. It can do so because it has a healing system. If you are in good health, you will want to know about this system because it is what keeps you in good health and because you can enhance that condition. If you or people you love are sick, you will want to know about this system because it is the best hope for recovery. Part 1 builds a case for the existence of a healing system and presents evidence for its operation, including its interactions with the mind. At every level of biological organization, from DNA up, mechanisms of self-diagnosis, self-repair, and regeneration exist in us, always ready to become active when the need arises. Medicine that takes advantage of these innate mechanisms of healing is more effective than medicine that simply suppresses symptoms. This section includes stories of people I have known who have recovered from illness, often in spite of the predictions of doctors who saw no possibility of recovery or insisted that improvement could occur only with a great deal of Asclepian effort. As I have made it known that I am interested in cases of this sort, I have found more and more of them, and I believe that anyone who looks will find others. Spontaneous healing is a common occurrence, not a rare one. We may marvel at stories of spontaneous remissions of cancer, but pay little attention to more commonplace activities of the healing system, such as the repair of wounds. In fact, it is the ordinary day-to-day workings of the healing system that are most extraordinary. Part 2 of the book tells you how to optimize your healing system. You will find here specific information on modifying lifestyle to increase your healing potentials, including facts about food, environmental toxins, exercise, stress reduction, vitamins, supplements, and tonic herbs that can help you maintain your well-being. I will also suggest an 8-week program for gradually changing lifestyle in a manner that will enhance your natural healing power. Part 3 gives advice on managing illness. It analyzes the strengths and weaknesses of conventional and alternative treatments and identifies a number of strategies used by successful patients. I give suggestions here for using natural methods to ameliorate common kinds of illnesses, and also include a chapter on cancer as a special case, because that disease poses a unique challenge to the healing system, and the selection of treatments for it requires careful analysis of each individual's condition. And afterward, Prescriptions for Society considers how existing medical institutions would have to change to accommodate Hygieian philosophy. Until now, few doctors and scientists have looked for examples of healing. Therefore, it is not surprising that the phenomenon of spontaneous healing seems obscure and the concept of an internal healing system odd. I will contend that the more we embrace that concept, the more we will experience healing in our lives, and the less reason we will have to use medical interventions that are unnecessary, sometimes damaging, and consume so much money. Healing-oriented medicine would serve us much better than the present system, since it would be safer and surer as well as cheaper. I have written this book in an effort to help bring it into existence. And just as a personal aside here, if you're interested in osteopathy and the whole terrain theory versus germ theory and contextualizing Still's development of osteopathy within the emergence and transition of those two theories, or the vying of those two theories within global culture, there's a great section in my thesis that deals with that. The thesis, you can see a video on my channel that has to do with the rest of the thesis and all that. It touches on that. You can, and there's a link there where you can download the paper itself if you're interested. So, Prologue 1, in the rainforest. Let me take you with me to a faraway place I visited more than 20 years ago, the sandy bay of a wide river on a sultry afternoon in 1972. The river was a tributary of the Rio Caqueta in the northwest Amazon, near the common border of Colombia and Ecuador, and I was lost. I was searching for a shaman, a Kofan Indian named Pedro, who lived in a remote hut somewhere in the huge, dense forest, but the trail that was supposed to take me there left me at an uncrossable river with no sign of how to proceed. It was getting late in the day. 2 days before, after a long, hard drive, I left my Land Rover at the end of a dirt road and took a motorboat to a tiny frontier settlement, where I spent a restless night. The next day, I found some Indians who took me by canoe to the beginning of a trail they said would eventually bring me to the clearing where Pedro lived. Half a day's walk, they told me, but I knew that half a day's walk for an Indian might be much more for me. I had a backpack with essentials, but not much food, since I expected to be staying with the shaman. After several hours in dark forest, the trail forked. No one had said anything about a fork. I listened for the whisper of intuition and decided to go to the right. After another hour, I came upon a clearing with several huts and 5 Kofan men painting each other's faces. I was terribly hot and thirsty and asked in Spanish for water. The men ignored me. I asked again. They said they had no water. No water, I exclaimed. How can that be? They shrugged and continued to apply their makeup. I asked for the shaman. Not here, said one of the Indians. Where can I find him? There was an offhanded indication of a trail beyond the huts. Is it far? I asked. Another shrug. This was a new experience for me. In the hinterlands of Colombia, I had always found Indians to be exceedingly hospitable. It was the inhabitants of the rough frontier towns, the Mestizo, fortune hunters, who were unfriendly and intimidating. Once I passed through them to Indian territory, I always felt safe, assured that the native people would take in a stranger, help him find his destination, and certainly give water to a thirsty traveler. The 5 Kofan men were young, handsome, and obviously vain. They wore simple cotton tunics, had long, glossy black hair, and were intently devoted to their cosmetic art. After one would apply new markings to forehead or cheek, the recipient would spend long minutes evaluating the additions in a broken piece of mirrored glass, grunting approval or requesting further embellishment. This was clearly going to take all afternoon. My presence held not the slightest interest for them, and after half an hour of being ignored, I put on my pack and continued down the trail until several hours later it disappeared in a dense thicket at the edge of a big river, leaving me stranded. It was strikingly beautiful there, although I was inclined to view the river and forest more as obstacles than as sources of sensory pleasure. Big billowy cumulus clouds floated above the canopy of trees. The river was swift and clear. There was not a sign of human presence, no sounds except those of insects and birds. Were it not for the sandflies, small biting pests that were out in great numbers from dawn to dusk, I would not have minded camping there. I had a hammock and mosquito net in my pack, and could have spent the night if necessary, but I felt anxious at the prospect of being lost, and discouraged by the fruitlessness of my quest. This shaman, so difficult to reach, was said to be a powerful healer. In a year I spent wandering in South America, most of the shamans I met were disappointing. Some were drunks. Some were clearly out for fame and fortune. One, when he learned I was a doctor from Harvard, was interested only in persuading me to obtain for him a certificate from that institution testifying to his powers so that he could one-up his rivals. I had plenty of adventures during these travels, but in the end none of them had taught me how to be a better doctor. Pedro was my last hope. He was unknown to the outside world. I would be the first gringo to visit him, and I had high hopes that he would teach me the secrets of healing that I had so long been searching for. But now I was lost, and the brilliant Amazon sun was taking on the rich golden tones of the end of afternoon. Night would come quickly here, meaning surprising chilliness along the river and no chance of reaching a habitation. I lit up 3 cigarettes at once, Pale Rojas, Redskins, the local cheap brand, with a picture of a North American Indian in full war bonnet on the pack. I puffed on them and blew smoke all around me, hoping for some temporary relief from the sandflies. When in doubt, eat. I broke into my meager stores and found a packet of coca mix and some dried fruit. I set up a little butane stove, boiled some river water, and soon was sipping the hot liquid, which never tasted better. A bit of comfort and familiarity in this, for me, strange environment. I was in this remote part of South America because I was searching for something I believed to be exotic and extraordinary, something worlds away from my ordinary experience. I was looking for insight into the source of healing power and the interconnectedness of magic, religion, and medicine. I wanted to understand how the mind interacts with the body. Above all, I hoped to learn practical secrets of helping people to get well. I had spent 8 years in a prestigious institution of higher learning, 4 studying botany and 4 studying medicine, but I had found no clear answers to my questions. My botanical studies awakened a desire to see the rainforest, meet native practitioners, and help rescue fast disappearing knowledge of medicinal plants. My medical training made me want to flee from the world of invasive technological treatment toward a romantic ideal of natural healing. 3 years before, in 1969, when I finished my basic clinical training, I made a conscious decision not to practice the kind of medicine I had just learned. I did so for two reasons, one emotional and one logical. The first was simply a gut feeling that if I were sick, I would not want to be treated the way I had been taught to treat others, unless there were no alternative. That made me uncomfortable about treating others. The logical reason was that most of the treatments I had learned in 4 years at Harvard Medical School and one of internship did not get to the root of disease processes and promote healing, but rather suppressed those processes or merely counteracted the visible symptoms of disease. I had learned almost nothing about health and its maintenance, about how to prevent illness, a great omission, because I have always believed that the primary function of doctors should be to teach people how not to get sick in the first place. The word doctor comes from the Latin word for teacher. Teaching prevention should be primary, treatment of existing disease secondary. I am uneasy about the suppressive nature of conventional medicine. If you look at the names of the most popular categories of drugs in use today, you will find that most of them begin with the prefix anti. We use antispasmodics and antihypertensives, anti-anxiety agents, and antidepressants, antihistamines, antiarrhythmics, antitussives, antipyretics, and anti-inflammatories, as well as beta blockers and H2 receptor antagonists. This is truly anti-medicine. Medicine that is, in essence, counteractive and suppressive. Excuse me. What is wrong with that, you may ask? If a fever is in the danger zone or an allergic reaction is out of control, of course those symptoms should be counteracted. I have no objection to use of these treatments on a short-term basis for the management of very severe conditions. But I came to realize early in my hospital days that if you rely on such measures as the main strategy for treating illness, you create two kinds of problems. First, you expose patients to risk because by their nature, pharmaceutical weapons are strong and toxic. Their desired effects are too often offset by side effects, by toxicity. Adverse reactions to the counteractive drugs of conventional medicine are a great black mark against the system, and I saw more than enough of them in my clinical training to know that there has to be a better way. Botanical medicine appealed to me because it offered the possibility of finding safe, natural alternatives to the drugs I had been taught to use. The second problem, less visible but more worrisome, is the chance that over time suppressive treatment may actually strengthen disease processes instead of resolving them. This possibility did not occur to me until I read the writings of a great medical heretic, Samuel Hahnemann, who lived from 1775 to 1843. The German prodigy and renegade physician who developed homeopathy, one of the major schools of alternative medicine. Homeopathy relies on very small doses of highly diluted remedies to catalyze healing responses. I am not a homeopath. I disagree with some key points of homeopathic theory, its opposition to immunization, for example, and find the system as a whole puzzling, as well as incompatible with current scientific models of physics and chemistry. Nonetheless, I have experienced and observed homeopathic cures and admire the system for its use of treatments that cannot harm. What is more, I find some of Hahnemann's ideas useful. One of his most important teachings concerns the danger of suppressing visible symptoms of illness. Hahnemann used the example of an itching red rash on the skin. Better to have disease on the surface of the body, he thought, because from the surface it can exit outward. Suppressive measures may drive a disease process inward toward more vital organs. The itchy rash may disappear, but worse trouble may appear down the road, trouble that may resist the strongest suppressive treatments. Hahnemann had this insight long before the discovery of corticosteroids, the very powerful anti-inflammatory hormones that conventional doctors now dispense without much thought for the harm they can do. Topical steroids are very effective suppressants of skin rashes and are now even sold over the counter in the United States. Again and again, I see patients who become dependent on them. As long as they use the steroid creams and ointments, their rashes are held in check, but as soon as the treatment is stopped, the symptoms reappear more severely than before. The disease process is not resolved, but merely held at bay, gathering power for renewed expression as soon as the outside, counteractive force is removed. When steroids are given systemically, their suppressive power and toxicity is even greater, Patients who take drugs like prednisone for months or years to control rheumatoid arthritis, asthma, and other autoimmune and allergic disorders commonly suffer terrible toxicity, weight gain, depression, ulcers, cataracts, weakened bones, acne, but cannot stop taking the drugs because their symptoms will return in full force. What happens to the energies of such suppressed diseases? Where do they go? My experience with patients confirms Hahnemann's warning. Recently, I saw a woman in her mid-30s who, 2 years before, had developed symptoms of a serious autoimmune disease, scleroderma. The disease began with episodes of painful blanching of the hands on exposure to cold. This is Raynaud's phenomenon, a sign of neurovascular instability that can exist by itself or herald deeper disturbances of nervous and circulatory function. In this case, it was followed by joint pain and swelling of the fingers. Then the skin of her fingers and hands began to thicken and harden, the classic visible manifestation of scleroderma. The word means hard skin. The hands of patients with advanced scleroderma are often cold, purplish, shiny, hard, and immobile. But this external change, while disfiguring, is not the worst effect of this disease. When scleroderma involves internal organs of the digestive and cardiorespiratory systems, it can kill. Doctors quickly diagnosed the problem and started the patient on high doses of prednisone and other immunosuppressive drugs. She responded dramatically. Within a few months, her skin returned to normal, all joint pain disappeared, and her physician pronounced her to be in complete remission, quote unquote. Unhappily, a year later, she developed shortness of breath. X-rays revealed pulmonary fibrosis, a progressive disease in which normal lung tissue is replaced by abnormal fibrous tissue. She was told that this condition was not related to the previous scleroderma, but in fact, pulmonary fibrosis is a well-known, albeit uncommon, manifestation of the same process, only in a much more vital area of the body and much more resistant to treatment. Her hands were warm, pink, and soft. There was no visible sign of disease on the surface of her body. Inside, however, she was being crippled by a disease in her lungs that now resisted all the counteractive power of conventional medicine. By the time I completed my medical internship, I had seen enough variations on this theme to convince me that I did not want to practice conventional medicine or take any further training in it. I did not know what else to practice, however, and that uncertainty led me to undertake my present quest. But after 2 difficult years of searching, I had learned little about healing. Shortly before coming to Kofan territory, I had concluded that I must not have made a sufficient effort to explore new terrain. The healers and shamans I had located were already discovered, too well known, too easy to find. What I was looking for must be still farther away, I thought, still harder to reach, more obscurely hidden in the Amazon forest. And so there I was, cocoa finished, day coming to an end, lost. I did eventually find Pedro the shaman, and I remember our meeting very well, even though it happened long ago, because it was a major turning point in my life. Of course, at the time I had no idea of its real significance, regarding it as just another in a long series of frustrations. In fact, it was the first step of a new path, one that would take me back to a place where I would discover what I had known all along but had been unable to recognize. Having packed up my equipment and shouldered my pack, I noticed a sandbar a short distance upriver. I thought that from its vantage point I might get a better view of the area and be able to make an educated guess as to the direction of Pedro's hut. I waded to the sandbar, and as I scanned the shore I spied what looked like a bit of a trail farther upstream. It was. I got to it by walking just at the water's edge, and once on it, felt my anxieties melt away, even as the sun got low in the west. After 45 minutes I came to a clearing where a small river entered the big one. At the junction, elevated on stilts, was a lone, thatched hut of ample size. I ran up to it just as the sky was blazing and with the colors of a tropical sunset, and climbed a rude staircase up to a deck overlooking the confluence of the rivers. There was no shaman in sight. The only inhabitant was a young Indian girl who spoke Spanish hesitantly and looked at me as I might regard an extraterrestrial. She told me that Pedro was gone. He had left 10 days ago and should have been back the day before. I asked if I could stay. She did not object, so I took off my pack and strung my hammock between two poles at the edge of the deck. For the next 4 days and nights, I stayed mostly in my hammock, pale roja cigarettes blazing in my fingers, watching the long hot days pass into clear starry nights. Occasionally I would brave the sandflies to go for an afternoon swim in the river. I tried unsuccessfully to engage the young woman of the house in conversation, and I sought refuge from the world of heat, humidity, blinding sun, and dense forest in a collection of Jack London's tales of the far north that I had brought with me for just such a circumstance. It was an inspired choice, the perfect literary escape into a world with igloos, ice fields, and numbing cold. But sadly it came to an end, so I reread it, and reread it again. There was one other diversion. Pedro had killed a jaguar shortly before he left. The jaguar had a young cub that was now in a cage in the house. It was appealingly cute and kittenish, and wanted interaction. On one occasion I had it out of the cage and was playing with it on the floor until its play became too rough for me. I wanted it to stop, but my attempts to push the cub away and calm it down stimulated the wild animal circuit in its brain. Suddenly it was no longer a cute kitten, but a vicious hellcat. The Indian girl came at it with a broom, and together we managed to get it back in its cage. I came away with nasty scratches and 2 good bites on my arms. Then one afternoon Pedro appeared and greeted me matter-of-factly. He was a vigorous, solemn man in his early 40s. I liked him at once, but he told me soon in our conversation that there would not be any point in my staying, because he had stopped practicing his profession. Instead of working as a healer, he had become a political activist and was trying to organize his fellow Kofan to fight a great threat to their way of life, the presence in their forest of La Texas. This was the local name for Texaco, which had come to the northwest Amazon to exploit its rich reserves of oil. I had once stayed briefly in a frontier town that served as Texaco's base and was appalled by what I saw and heard. It was a center of noise, mud, fumes, thieves, whores, and roughnecks that was spreading devastation from its margins. But the town was hundreds of miles from this peaceful region, and I could not imagine how it impacted on Pedro's life. He told me that the noise of Texaco's helicopters had driven game from the forest, and that, at the same time, fish were disappearing from the rivers. Hunting and fishing had declined drastically in the past 2 years, which he blamed entirely on the oil explorations. All of his efforts were now going to collecting signatures on a petition demanding reparations from Texaco. He was sorry I had come such a long way for nothing. I was too. At least I now understood why Kofan men would not be hospitable to a gringo walking through their forest. The next morning I left. Eventually I got back to my Land Rover and left Kofan territory for good. I was to spend another year wandering in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, but I never again made such an arduous journey in search of an exotic, magical healer. Instead, I studied medicinal plants in Ecuador and Peru, learned about the cultivation and use of coca leaf, worked with a Colombian filmmaker to document the use of drug plants by shamans, and looked for unusual fruits, spices, and dyes. Although I did not admit it to myself consciously, on some level I realized that what I was searching for was not to be found in the wilds of Amazonia or any other exotic location. I remained as committed as ever to finding answers to my questions. What is the source of healing? What is the relationship between treatments and cures? How can doctors and patients access healing more of the time? What my search for Pedro taught me was that I was looking for answers in the wrong way, that I did not have to turn from my own land and culture, my formal education, and my own self to find the source of healing. But I did have to spend those years wandering in order to figure that out. Almost a quarter of a century has passed since I left Pedro's hut at the junction of the 2 rivers. In that time, the destruction of the rainforest caused by the removal of oil has reached levels that Pedro and his people could never have imagined. Road building, oil spills, the dumping of toxic chemicals into rivers, and a cynical disregard for native cultures by both national governments and foreign businesses have damaged vast areas of Colombia and Ecuador irreparably. Simply put, the Kofan people have been put out of business. They are finished, terminated, and any knowledge held by their wise elders and traditional healers is soon to be lost forever. Other tribes now face the same threat. Whether they can avoid the fate of the Kofan is uncertain. The years have been much kinder to me. I found what I was looking for and more, found it much closer to home in ways both unexpected and satisfying. So there we go. That's the introduction. Try and keep that screensaver from coming back again here. So this is chapter 2, Right in My Own Backyard. This is where we get into his encounter with Robert Fulford. When I finished my South American travels in 1973, I began a long process of settling down in the vicinity of Tucson, Arizona, where I live to this day. I felt a strong affinity with the natural environment of the desert and made good connections with people and places in the area. One of those connections was with Sandy Newmark, a graduate student in anthropology at the University of Arizona, who became one of my neighbors in Espero Canyon in the foothills of the Catalina Mountains. Sandy subsequently left anthropology to be a farmer in the White Mountains of central Arizona. Then he returned to Tucson to enroll in medical school. Today he is my family's pediatrician. Here we go. Let's keep going. Sandy and his wife Linda, now a clinical psychologist, have a daughter, Sophia, who is developmentally retarded. When Sophia was a baby, many of the Newmark's friends offered suggestions for treatment. One was to take the baby to an unusual osteopathic physician named Robert Fulford, who had a good record of working with children suffering from all sorts of problems. Sandy and Linda were so impressed with him that they took Sophia for a number of his gentle sessions of cranial therapy. And Sandy, then in his first year of medical school at the University of Arizona, worked with Dr. Fulford for a time. He kept telling me I should meet him, but I was not interested, partially due to my ignorance about osteopaths. With the usual prejudices of medical doctors, I considered them second-rate MDs who dabbled in the kind of manipulation of the body more frequently done by chiropractors. I was also probably still attached to the romantic notion of finding a healer/teacher in some far-off, very different culture, this despite my repeated experience of coming back empty-handed from trips to remote places. It took many people telling me many times that I had to meet Dr. Fulford before I finally paid him a visit. Bob Fulford was then in his late 70s. He had come to Tucson from Cincinnati in retirement from an overwhelming practice. One night, after spending a year recovering from exhaustion, he received a desperate call from a friend whose baby was severely ill with pneumonia. The baby was in the hospital, not responding to antibiotics. Dr. Fulford went to the hospital, gave hands-on treatment, and the next morning the baby was out of danger. Within hours, people began calling him with requests for treatment, and he found himself drawn inexorably back out of retirement and into the practice of his own special form of osteopathic medicine. I was struck by the simplicity of Dr. Fulford's office, a waiting room with a nurse receptionist and 2 treatment rooms. Except for a diploma from the Kansas City College of Osteopathy on the wall, there were no distinguishing features and none of the equipment normally associated with a medical office. Dr. Fulford appeared kind and grandfatherly. He was tall, strong, and relaxed, with large, wonderful hands. He spoke quietly and sparingly. I told him I had heard much about his effectiveness and wanted to experience his treatments for myself. "Well, what's wrong with you?" he asked. "Not much," I told him. "My neck's been bothering me a little. Sometimes it gets pretty stiff and sore." "Well, let's see what we can do about it," he said. He asked me to stand, put his hands on my shoulders, and observed my breathing. Then he moved my head in different directions. "Just get up here on the table," he directed. I lay on my back and watched him wheel over a stand with a curious instrument on a long power cord. The instrument was his percussion hammer, a modified dentist's drill motor with a thick round metal disc that vibrated up and down. Dr. Fulford sat on a stool next to the table, adjusted the vibration rate, and put the disc in contact with my right shoulder. I could feel the vibrations through the whole right side of my body, pleasant and relaxing, but hardly major therapy. After several minutes, Dr. Fulford's hand gave a little jerk, and he muttered, "There she goes." With that, he removed the percussion hammer and placed it in a new spot on my right hip. He continued this routine for 20 minutes while I drifted in and out of daydreams. Then he turned off the machine, moved his stool to the end of the table, and put his hands on the sides of my head, his fingers around my ears. For the next few minutes he cradled my head, applying the gentlest of pressure, now here, now there. It was one of the least dramatic forms of body work I had ever felt, so much so that I doubted it could accomplish anything. At the same time, it felt reassuring to be held by such experienced, confident hands. When this phase of the treatment was over, Dr. Fulford checked the mobility of my limbs, then asked me to sit up. He finished with a few more familiar manipulations to crack my spine. "There, that should do it," he said. "What did you find?" I asked. "Not much," he replied. "A few little restrictions in the shoulder that were probably causing your neck to get sore. Your cranial impulses are very good." I had no idea what cranial impulses were, but I was glad to hear mine were good. As for restrictions in the shoulder and how they might cause a stiff neck, I was equally in the dark, but no further explanation was offered, and Dr. Fulford indicated that our time was up. He told me I was welcome to come back any time and watch him work. I was pleasantly surprised to learn that the charge for this session was only $35, clearly a bargain, if only for the relaxation it provided. Still, I failed to see how this minimal intervention could account for all the stories I had heard about Dr. Fulford's clinical successes. I resolved to come back and watch him treat others. The next day I was surprised to find that I was fatigued and sore. I called Dr. Fulford to ask if this could be a result of his work. "Oh, yes," he said. "That's perfectly normal. You might feel it for a couple of days." And so I did. After that I felt fine, and my neck did, indeed, bother me less, but I did not notice any other change. About a month later, I began spending a few hours a week in the doctor's little office on Grant Road, watching the old man work with patients. His office was always full, often with parents and children, representing a cross-section of the diverse groups that populate southern Arizona, including Hispanics and Asians, city folk and country folk. All came with high expectations and gratitude just for the chance to see this man. At the least, Dr. Fulford was a wonderful role model of the old-fashioned, caring family doctor who made people feel better just by the warmth of his presence and his own personal example of good health. Observing him, I was surprised by the brevity of his histories and physical examinations. He asked very few questions when a new patient walked in the door. "What's the problem? How long has it been bothering you? Did you ever take any bad falls in your childhood? Do you know anything about the circumstances of your birth?" And maybe a few more. Then he stood people up, checked the patient's limbs and breathing, rotated their heads, and asked them to lie on the table. He administered to most people the same kinds of treatments I received. A slow going over with the percussion hammer, held to various parts of the body until some sort of release occurred, when his hand holding the instrument would jerk suddenly, then slow, imperceptible hands-on manipulation of the head, and finally a few adjustments of the back. He rarely volunteered explanations of what he thought was wrong or what he aimed to do, but if people asked, he would do so in a few words. Most people did not ask. They just seemed to entrust themselves or their children to the doctor and let him work in silence. Everyone relaxed in Dr. Fulford's hands, even restless, fussy children, who would calm down almost as soon as he touched them. Often at the end of the session, he gave people strange daily exercises to perform, exercises that I had never seen before. One he recommended frequently went like this: stand with your feet apart at shoulder width and extend the arms to the side. Extend the arms to the side fully, with the left palm facing up and the right palm facing down. Breathe deeply and regularly, holding this position until the strain in the upper arms and shoulders becomes unbearable. Then as slowly as you can, raise the arms above the head, keeping them fully extended until the hands touch. Then lower the arms and relax. "What was that supposed to do?" I asked him. "It opens the chest and allows the breath to expand," was the answer. Another Fulford exercise was to sit on the edge of a chair with feet flat on the floor and shoulder width apart. With feet flat on the floor, shoulder width apart. Then bend forward and with the arms inside the legs, grasp the bottoms of the feet with the hands. Hold this position for a few minutes and it gently stretches the lower vertebrae, allowing for a greater motion of the spine. Sometimes when patients came back, Dr. Fulford, on examining them, would say, "You haven't been doing your exercise," or "Good, you've been doing your exercise." And the patients would confirm that this was so. He often told patients not to come back. "When do you want to see me again?" they might ask as they got off the table. "I don't need to see you again," Dr. Fulford would say. "You're fixed." "But don't I need any follow-up?" they might persist. Dr. Fulford smiled and shook his head. "I took the shock out of your system," he would say. "Now just let old Mother Nature do her job." If there was any disappointment among Dr. Fulford's patients, it had to do with their not having to see him again, since the experience of his treatment was so satisfying. Gradually I began to realize that I was seeing something quite extraordinary. This old man of strong hands and few words was in fact fixing people who came to him with a wide range of disorders, often in one session of therapy that, on the surface, seemed minimal. I heard tale after tale of long-standing problems resolved after 1 or 2 visits to Dr. Fulford, problems that had not responded to conventional medicine. And these were not just aches, pains, and other musculoskeletal ailments, but also hormonal and digestive disturbances, sleep disorders, asthma, ear infections, and more. How could such undramatic treatment give such dramatic results? I began to ask Dr. Fulford about the why and wherefore of his methods. What was the theory behind them? Just what was he doing? The answers I received sounded like nothing I had learned at Harvard Medical School. Bob Fulford was a pure old-time osteopath in the tradition of the man who founded the system, Andrew Taylor Still, who lived from 1828 to 1917. Of Kirksville, Missouri. A.T. Still, the old doctor, to his contemporaries, was a renegade physician who disowned the toxic drugs of his colleagues in favor of a drugless system of therapy based on manipulation of bones. His idea was to adjust the body mechanically in order to allow the circulatory and nervous systems to function smoothly, bringing natural healing power to any ailing part. The new profession that he founded in 1874 was very successful in its early years, but by the middle of the 20th century, it was eclipsed by the spectacular rise of modern scientific medicine, also known as allopathic medicine. In response, osteopaths abandoned Still's teachings and began to behave increasingly like MDs. Today, the MD and DO degrees are equivalent. Most osteopaths rely on drugs and surgery, and few use manipulation as a primary modality of treatment. Nevertheless, there has always existed within the osteopathic profession a minor tradition of healers who use no drugs and continue to refine A.T. Still's insights into the nature of the human body and its potential to heal itself. One of those was William Sutherland, who in 1939 announced to his colleagues his discovery of an aspect of human physiology he called the primary respiratory mechanism, and a technique for modifying it that became known as cranial therapy or craniosacral therapy. Osteopathy in the cranial field would be the correct term. Sutherland worked on his theory for many years to ensure its correctness before going public. Nonetheless, it met with great resistance, and only a small percentage of osteopaths accepted it. One of those was the young Robert Fulford, then just beginning his general practice in Cincinnati. Sutherland's insight was that the central nervous system and its associated structures were in constant rhythmic motion, and that this motion was an essential feature, perhaps the most essential feature of human life and health. He identified 5 components of the mechanism: motion at the cranial sutures, the joints linking the 26 bones of the skull, expansion and contraction of the hemispheres of the brain, motion of the membranes covering the brain and spinal cord, a fluid wave within the cerebrospinal fluid that bathes the brain and spinal cord, involuntary subtle motion of the sacrum or tailbone. Sutherland thought that the rhythmic expansion and contraction of this system resembled breathing, but since it was occurring in the most vital, most essential organs, he called it primary respiration, to indicate its importance in the hierarchy of body functions and distinguish it from secondary respiration, the familiar motions of the chest, lungs, and diaphragm associated with the exchange of air. He postulated that an intact, freely moving primary respiratory mechanism was necessary to full health. Any restrictions in it could lead to disease, since the central nervous system regulated all other organs. One of the main heresies in Sutherland's formulation was the notion that the cranial bones move. Generations of anatomists had taught that the joints of the skull are fixed and immobile. Not only MDs, but also most DOs refused to consider the idea of cranial motion. Dr. Fulford was not one of them, and he started training himself to feel those motions by putting his hands on people's heads. It is only in recent years that researchers at Michigan State University College of Osteopathic Medicine have confirmed Sutherland's theory with X-ray films of living skulls that now show cranial motion. Those motions can be measured by sensitive instruments. Bob Fulford would argue that the most sensitive instruments are the hands of a practiced physician. He trained himself to feel a human hair under 17 sheets of paper, and he says that anyone can develop similar touch sensitivity with enough practice. Under Dr. Fulford's guidance, I began feeling heads myself to see if I could detect cranial impulses. At first I felt mainly my own pulse, but as I practiced I began to feel the subtle breath-like motion that Dr. Fulford considers the most vital expression of life. At least I felt it in people who had well-running primary respiratory mechanisms. Once he asked me to feel the head of a woman who, he said, had no detectable cranial impulses. She had been in several bad accidents, one 20 years before, and now suffered extreme fatigue, insomnia, migraine headaches, weak vision, poor digestion, and increased susceptibility to infection. Her head felt like a bag of cement, a dead weight, the rhythm of life not present. After several sessions of treatment, her cranial motions began to return, and as they did, her health began to improve. What causes impairment to this system? I asked Dr. Fulford. Trauma was the answer. 3 kinds of trauma. The first is birth trauma. If the first breath of life is not perfectly full, the cranial rhythms are restricted from the start. That first breath is so important. In my lifetime, I've seen problems of this sort increase steadily, which I think is a black mark against our obstetrical practices. The second common reason is physical trauma, especially in early life. Any fall or blow that knocks the wind out of you, that causes the breath cycle to be interrupted, even for a moment, can cause permanent, lifelong restriction in the primary respiratory mechanism. It's possible to feel and identify and undo those restrictions with your hands. That's what I call taking the shock out of the body. And a third reason, maybe less common, is major psychological trauma, again, especially in early life. I estimate that 95% of people have restrictions of one degree or another in this function. Around the time Dr. Fulford was teaching these new concepts to me, I was helping a friend through a medical crisis. Kim Clifton was a 34-year-old marine biologist who spent most of the year on the Pacific beaches of southern Mexico, trying to save an endangered species of sea turtle that was being hunted to extinction. He directed a World Wildlife Fund project that kept him in the field leading a rough, adventurous life, except for the summer months when the turtles headed out to sea. Then he would come up to Tucson, looking bedraggled, to tell his stories and gather his strength. For several years he had suffered from intestinal problems, episodes of severe diarrhea in Mexico, inability to digest many foods, and abdominal pain. He would routinely take courses of antibiotics and antiparasitic drugs, but year by year, the episodes became more frequent and more intense. Now he came to me having lost 20 pounds, saying that he had not had a formed bowel movement in months, that his stool frequently contained blood and mucus, that he had constant abdominal pain and increasing debility. He did not think he would be able to continue his turtle work. Kim wanted prescriptions to knock out what he thought were more parasites in his gut, but the picture he presented was not one of infection. Instead, he seemed to me to have chronic inflammatory bowel disease, possibly ulcerative colitis, and I urged him to see a highly recommended gastroenterologist at the University of Arizona Health Sciences Center. Kim was the son of a pulmonary surgeon in New York, and he had great faith in conventional medicine. That faith was tested, however, when after a long and expensive series of tests, culminating in a biopsy of the colon, the gastroenterologist could not identify the nature of the problem, except to say that Kim's colon was severely and chronically inflamed. Ulcerative colitis was definitely a possibility. I think we should go in and take out more tissue, the gastroenterologist told me. Then maybe we'll find out what the hell he's got. So that's the gastroenterologist talking to Andrew Weil. This did not sound encouraging, but since Kim was paying for it out of his own pocket, I suggested looking for another approach. Then it occurred to me to send Kim to Dr. Fulford. Kim had a long history of playing contact sports, including boxing. He had been a heavyweight in the army and had suffered many traumatic injuries. I noticed that he always breathed through his mouth. In addition to the intestinal problems he complained of, he also complained of episodes of bad back and neck pain. It seemed to me that Dr. Fulford might be able to make sense of his whole picture, but I foresaw two problems. The first was that Dr. Fulford was now only seeing patients under 30, a limit he imposed because his practice was again getting out of hand as his reputation grew. Excuse me. I'm almost 80, he said to me one day, and I can't work myself to exhaustion anymore. My energies go further with younger folks. Their healing responses are stronger. He had invented the percussion hammer to make things easier on himself too. What it accomplished could be done by hand, he said, but with much more effort. The second problem was that Kim, having grown up with conventional medicine and lacking any experience with alternative practitioners, might be reluctant to trust himself to one. I did my best to explain to both Dr. Fulford and Kim why they should see each other, and I succeeded, except that Kim couldn't see how an osteopath was going to help his colon. Just tell him all your symptoms, I urged him, all the intestinal symptoms as well as the pains in your back and neck. I was unable to be in the office that day and waited expectantly to see Kim when he came home. He's a quack, were Kim's first words. I mean, he's a nice old man, but he doesn't do anything. What did he tell you? I asked. He said I was in critical condition, that my cranial motions were completely shut down because of old injuries, and that the cranial nerve controlling the digestive system was not functioning as a result. Also that the same injuries make me breathe through my mouth, and that doesn't nourish my brain as breathing should. Did he say he was able to help you? He said he took care of most of it, and that I should come back in 3 weeks, but he seemed so feeble, and he's got all these nervous tics. I feel sorry for him. At least it didn't cost much. What do you mean by nervous tics? I asked. You know, when he has that vibrator on you, every few minutes his hand flies up in the air and his whole body jerks. Really? Yes, it's kind of sad. I called Dr. Fulford for his view of the session. Mr. Clifton came in not a moment too soon, he told me. His whole primary respiratory mechanism was shut down. I think he would have gone really downhill fast. I think he really would have gone downhill fast. Were you able to help him? Oh yes, I got major releases from many parts of his body, undid a lot of trauma, and got the impulses flowing again. Once the vagus nerve kicks in, he'll be all right. He should just take it easy now and let old Mother Nature do her job. 6 hours after the treatment, Kim's diarrhea stopped for the first time in 8 months, never to return. Over the next 3 months, he regained all of his lost weight and energy. The back and neck pain disappeared, and he stopped breathing through his mouth. He saved my life, Kim told me later. I'm convinced that man saved my life. He has since become a passionate convert to alternative medicine in general, and osteopathy in particular. This cure was so impressive that I tried to arrange a conference to discuss the case with Dr. Fulford, Kim, myself, and the university gastroenterologist. That doctor said he was interested, but failed to show. When I asked him why, he told me, "Look, I'm not going to argue with success, but I can't believe that osteopathic treatment had anything to do with the outcome." Shortly afterward, I had another opportunity to witness Dr. Fulford's skill with the human body, this time firsthand. I was working in my garden with a friend. In a freak accident that I could never reconstruct, he stood up as I bent down, and his shoulder hit me hard in the right side of the face, just forward of the ear. There was a sharp pain, and I could neither open nor close my mouth fully. It felt as if my jaw were partially dislocated, and I couldn't get it to go back, no matter what I did. I called Dr. Fulford and told him what had happened. "Get on down here," he said. I drove myself to his office and walked in, still in pain and unable to make my jaw work. He made time in his lineup of patients and told me to get on the table. As soon as he put his hands on my head, he named the bone in my skull that was out of place. Then he began the gentlest of manipulations. After a few minutes he said, "There, it's back." I felt nothing happen and no change in the discomfort. He said I could get up. "It still hurts," I said, disappointed. "Oh, the muscles will be sore for a while yet," he replied. "Well, I've got to get busy." I left, unconvinced that I had been helped, contemplating a visit to the emergency room of the university hospital. But 10 minutes later, as I was sitting at a stoplight, I suddenly realized that the pain was not there, and that I could open and close my mouth normally. Incredible. Thank you, Dr. Fulford. Then I thought, what would you have done if you didn't know about him? Probably I would have visited an emergency room, undergone x-rays, and have been sent home with painkillers, muscle relaxants, and the expectation of a large bill. Possibly I would have remained unhealed for weeks or months. Now I was truly inspired to learn everything I could from Dr. Fulford. I also became increasingly frustrated in trying to explain my excitement to colleagues. Most doctors were no more interested in my stories than the gastroenterologist had been. It was especially annoying to try to talk with pediatricians about the Fulford approach to ear infections in children. Recurrent infection of the middle ear, otitis media, is the bread and butter of pediatricians. So common is it that an ever-growing number of people in our society accept it as a normal part of growing up. The conventional treatments are antibiotics and decongestants, and sometimes surgical placement of tubes through the eardrums to equalize pressure. Commonly, the drug treatments end episodes of infection sooner or later, only for new episodes to recur at frequent intervals. Bob Fulford was outstandingly successful at permanently ending this cycle in young children, often with just one session of treatment, in which he concentrated on freeing up the sacrum. I just beat the heck out of their tailbones, was the way he put it, because he found that the sacral end of the craniosacral system was often the one that was locked up in children, probably from trauma suffered during birth. Here's how he explained the situation. When the sacrum is restricted, the whole primary respiratory mechanism is impaired. Along with this goes a pattern of restricted breathing, and it is the force of the breath, the rhythmic pressure changes in the chest, that pumps the lymphatic circulation. With inadequate lymphatic circulation, there is poor fluid drainage from the head and neck. Stagnant fluid builds up in the middle ear, providing an ideal breeding ground for bacteria. You can wipe out the bacteria all you want with antibiotics, but if you don't correct the underlying problem of fluid stagnation, they're just going to come back. Certainly, this is the usual experience of kids, parents, and pediatricians. The bacteria just come back. I saw case after case go through Dr. Fulford's office in which this simple treatment cured otitis media permanently. Often I could see a change in breathing as soon as the child got off the table. Greater, more symmetrical expansion of the chest, deeper breaths. Yet I could not get one pediatrician from the Tucson medical community to come to Dr. Fulford's office and watch. Instead of being interested in my accounts of his treatment, the medical men seemed threatened. Finally, one practitioner, an Englishwoman, agreed to watch. She even sent a patient, with such good result that she consented to help me make a documentary film of Dr. Fulford with the Biomedical Communications Department of the University of Arizona. The more I watched Bob Fulford work, the more impressed I was with his own health and vigor. And just as a side note, I'm going to put a link in the show notes here. Show notes, it's not a show. I'm going to put a link in the video notes to that video. It's on YouTube as well. The documentary film that Weil made of Fulford. The more I watched Bob Fulford work, the more I was impressed with his own health and vigor. At 80, he was an inspiration for successful aging. Once I asked him of his personal secret of good health. "I'll show you," he said. And with that took a deep, slow breath that went on so long that I stared in disbelief. His chest expanded enormously. When he exhaled, then he exhaled as spaciously. "The more air you can breathe in and out, the more nourishment you can give to the central nervous system," he said afterwards. Good breathing is the key. The medicine I saw Bob Fulford practice was the kind of medicine I had longed for during my years of clinical training and my years of wandering. It was non-violent medicine that did not suppress disease, but rather encouraged the body's own healing potential to express itself. Dr. Fulford was the first practitioner I met who adhered religiously to the two most famous admonitions of Hippocrates: first, do no harm, and honor the healing power of nature. I had learned so much by simply watching him work, being worked on by him, and having informal discussions with him. His answers to my questions were always brief and in ordinary language, unsophisticated by the standards of academic medicine, but bright with wisdom and full of useful practical information. Here are some ideas I took away from my time with him that I have found most useful in my own work as a physician. The body wants to be healthy. Health is the condition of perfect balance, when all systems run smoothly and energy circulates freely. This is the natural condition, the one in which least effort is expended. Therefore, when the body is out of balance, it wants to get back to it. Treatment can and should take advantage of this tendency to return to the condition of health. Healing is a natural power. When Dr. Fulford told patients to relax and let Old Mother Nature do her job, he was expressing in a folksy way his great faith in the vis medicantrix naturae of Hippocrates. That's honor the healing power of nature. A concept missing from conventional medicine. Never in my years at Harvard Medical School did anyone mention it to me and my classmates, nor do medical school professors talk about it to students today. That seems to me to be the greatest single philosophical deficit of modern medicine, a defect that has immense practical significance, since it underlies our inability to find cost-effective solutions to common health problems. My friend Linda Newmark said that Dr. Fulford told her the best thing she could do for her husband Sandy while he was in medical school was to take him out in nature for regular walks. He explained to her, he'll need that to balance all the other stuff they're putting into his head. The body is a whole, and all of its parts are connected. Dr. Fulford had a brilliant, intuitive understanding of the body as a unified functioning system. When a patient came in complaining of a pain in the knee, he did not automatically conclude that the problem was in the knee and proceed to work there. He knew that the knee is the compensating joint for both the ankle and the hip. If there is a restriction in an ankle as a result of an old injury, the ankle will not be able to respond as it should to gravity, and motion will transmit a distorted force up the leg. The knee will compensate for the distortion in order to keep the pelvis in its normal position, and the strain of the compensating effort might be experienced as knee pain. If the knee is locked for any reason, the distortion from the ankle can reach the hip, causing lower back pain. How many knee and back operations were performed, Dr. Fulford wondered, for problems that actually originated in locked-up ankles? I saw him cure cases of chronic knee and back pain by unlocking ankles with his percussion hammer. Bob Fulford thought the restrictions he talked about occurred in the fascia, the tough connective tissue that covers muscles and separates spaces inside the body. Anatomists teach that fascia exists as separate sheets, but Fulford worked on the premise that all of the fascia throughout the body is one big convoluted piece. If a restriction occurs anywhere in it, it distorts the fabric of the whole. Hence, local changes can have global effects. Similarly, when Kim Clifton came with the complaints of neck and back pain, excuse me. When Kim Clifton came with his complaints of neck and back pain, mouth breathing, and chronic bowel disease, Dr. Fulford looked at this whole picture of disturbed physiology and identified a common root in an old traumatic injury of the head. The gastroenterologist, who only looked at Kim's colon, could make no sense of the problem and had no treatments to offer except drugs to suppress the inflammation in the colon. There is no separation of mind and body. Just as Dr. Fulford believed that psychological trauma could interfere with the respiratory motions of the central nervous system, so also did he presume that physical interventions, by their effect on the nervous system, could improve psychological functioning. He regularly raised IQs of learning disabled children by his cranial therapy. In fact, he was so successful at this that a state hospital for developmentally retarded children in Louisiana had him come for a few weeks every year to work on their patients. The beliefs of practitioners strongly influenced the healing powers of patients. Dr. Fulford believed that the patients he treated could get better. He had a simple, genuine, and very beautiful faith in their potential for healing, which he communicated in many ways, both verbal and non-verbal. That was one reason so many people gravitated to him. He was also careful to select those cases he thought he could help. If you had a broken bone, he would tell you, "There's nothing I can do for a broken bone. Let nature heal it, then come to me and I'll take the shock of the injury out of your system." Neither would he treat problems requiring surgery or other forms of emergency care. As he got older and the demands on him increased steadily, he kept lowering the age limit of patients he accepted. Soon it was 25, then 20. Ideally, he would have liked to restrict his practice to infants. Because their healing potential is so great and their restrictions have not had time to become fixed in body structures. That's a quote. He also thought all newborns should have prophylactic treatment because, quote, "so many illnesses in later life are long-term consequences of traumatic birth, and for the first 24 hours of life, the bones are not like jelly. The bones are just like jelly. It takes no effort to put them back the way they should be." Dr. Fulford did not succeed with everyone, but he had a higher percentage of successful outcomes than any other practitioner I have met. Eventually, the workload became overwhelming, and Bob Fulford, to the great dismay of his patients and followers, announced that he was going into permanent retirement and moving back to southern Ohio. He did so, but as I write this, he is still, at the age of 90, actively teaching cranial therapy. He travels around the country lecturing, instructing students in technique, and inspiring new generations of physicians to become true doctors. Discovering Dr. Fulford in my own backyard after chasing all over the world was a powerful lesson. I did not have to look out there for what I wanted. Neither do most people have to look out there for healing. Of course, it is worth searching for the best treatment, since treatment comes from outside. But healing comes from within. Its source in our very nature as living organisms. So there you go. Isn't that interesting? Some practical tips for the osteos and some interesting anecdotes for all the rest of us as well. Hope you enjoyed that.